and thank you for listening to a live recording of the History of World War II podcast, episode 187. With us today is writer Scott Miller as we discuss his latest book, Agent 110, An American Spymaster and the German Resistance in World War II. Scott Miller is a former correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and his first book, The President and the Assassin, McKinley, Terror, and Empire at the Dawn of the American Century, was a Newsweek must-read summer selection. Mr. Miller spent nearly 2 decades in Asia and Europe, reporting from more than 25 countries. This book, Agent 110, covers the secret and suspenseful account of how OSS Spymaster Allen Dulles led a network of Germans conspiring to assassinate Hitler and negotiate surrender to bring about the end of World War II before the Soviets advance. So, Mr. Miller, thank you very much for being with us today. I certainly appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So just to start off, to let all the readers know right off the bat, this was an absolute corker of a read. I was able to, even after all these years of reading stuff about World War II since I was 12 years old, I was able to learn a lot. And that's always nice to turn a page and go, I didn't know that. So that's great. I think at some point in the book, you're throwing in Julia Childs, Lenin, and even Carl Jung at some point. So it was really nice to get some of these smaller stories in the much larger story that is the OSS. I enjoyed that a lot.
That's one of the things I really enjoyed about writing the book was, and it surprised me, was just the great supporting cast of characters of really unlikely people. That made it a lot of fun to work on.
And the best part for me, and everybody out there who's thinking about getting this book should absolutely know, I love the focus of the book because as the story of World War II winds down, and we all know the broad strokes of World War II, the drama and the tension in the book is actually building up, driving me crazy at the end because you don't know who you can trust, you don't know who's telling the truth, you don't know what their ultimate goal is, and so the drama and the tension just build up right up to the end, and I'm drinking cup after cup of cold coffee because I keep forgetting to drink my coffee because I'm sticking to the last 5 chapters of the book. I really like the way you were able to build that up, even though the obvious storyline is going down. Dulles just finds himself more and more wrapped up in, can I get this done? You know, what's the future of the OSS? What's my future? And he's just trying to show the validity of what he can do, even though he's I don't know, is he a maverick? Is he a cowboy? He hates rules. He doesn't want anybody looking over his shoulder. And he likes the danger and he likes the drama. We'll get into all that, but I just really like the way you were able to just ratchet it up as the book goes on.
Mm-hmm. Well, not to get ahead of ourselves and get to the end of the war, but, there was a lot of tension in how the whole thing would unfold. And the Soviets were convinced that the Brits and the Americans were going to team up against them. Stalin was terrified of that happening throughout the whole war. So there was great tension, and Hitler was really banking on it till the very end. He thought he might be able to drive a wedge between the Allies, between the Soviets and the Western Allies, and so it really, right to the bitter end, there was hopes on the German side that maybe they could wreck the alliance and maybe save themselves.
Absolutely. Hitler was right. It just happened, unfortunately for him, good for us, but after the war's over. So there was a breakdown. So he pegged it right. Just the timing couldn't save him. So let's just jump into this. So when we have Pearl Harbor and then America's into the war, we decide that we're going to liberate Europe first and then go after the Pacific. However, because of the isolationist policies in between the wars, it's not like America has this vast espionage network set up in Europe. We don't know much about what's going on in Germany. We certainly don't know much about a resistance within Germany to get rid of Hitler. So if you could kind of paint us a picture of Allen Dulles before November of 1942 when he makes his way to Switzerland and what kind of guy he was. And then we'll talk about him literally going there and then just hitting the ground running because he was that type of person.
Yeah, he definitely was. Dulles he was born to a pretty patrician family. 2 relatives had been Secretary of State, and his grandfather, John Foster, who was Secretary of State to Harrison, really kind of took Allen Dulles and his older brother, of course, John Foster Dulles, who later became Secretary of State, under his wing. And, there's great family stories of all of them kind of at this family compound in upstate New York in Henderson Harbor. And the boys got to meet, really important dignitaries. So there's one great story of when Alan was young. He went down and he was hanging out with his grandpa in Washington and was listening to the grown-ups talking about the Boer War. And so he took it upon himself and he wrote a little book, actually, Alan did as a kid, about the Boer War.
Wow.
And his grandfather was so impressed with the whole thing that he had the book published with the spelling mistakes and everything. And then the Washington Post actually wrote a review of that.
Wow.
So not surprisingly, Alan entered the State Department and did a tour in Europe and was in Turkey. He had been an international lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell on Wall Street. So all this really kind of, for me, painted the picture of somebody who wasn't your typical spy. He was raised in this background of tremendous ambition and kind of an ability to look at things from 30,000 feet. So when World War II broke out and William Donovan recruited him, they'd known each other from Wall Street days a little bit, and recruited him to go to work for the OSS. It was really kind of a different animal that Donovan was signing on to. And there was kind of some tension between Donovan and Dulles. You know, as I said, Dulles was very ambitious, and I'm not sure that he was too jazzed about working for somebody else. And there's a great story of when Dulles was in New York before he went to Switzerland, and he was having a meeting with Donovan at the St. Regis Hotel, and he went up to his room, opened the door, and there were secret papers spread all over the room and the bed, and apparently Donovan was in the bathroom or something, but he didn't lock the door. And so Dulles scooped up these papers, went down to the lobby, and phoned Donovan and said, I have a question about those secret papers. Can you find those for me? I wanted to... And Donovan was not too thrilled about that. Dulles got a real kick out of it. So I think there was a big part of Donovan who was happy to get to get Dulles out of his hair and off in far off Switzerland.
And that's the amazing thing. Everybody has to remember one of the main rules of reading or writing history is that you should not judge people by today's standards. It doesn't work. It was a different time. They were different people with different worldviews. And so I'm reading about Dulles from your book. And I mean, this guy's the American James Bond. He doesn't like rules. He's got tons of cash. Even though he's got a wife that he loves, and he even calls her an angel in your book. I mean, he's a playboy, because I think I read in your book something like it was just this mentality. That's one of the benefits of being, I mean, as we say in the United States, he was born on third base, and there was just a world that was just open to him. It was just a part of the privilege of being born into that social elite.
But you're absolutely right, and I've thought about that quite a bit too. Judging these historical figures, from the 40s in this case, and applying sort of modern, and I don't want to excuse a lot of what
absolutely.
he did, because it was bad in the day too. But it seems especially bad now, and it's always kind of a tricky thing to judge them, morally, or judge what they did. So I don't know. That was something I was very aware of throughout the book, definitely.
Yeah, it was like whenever I'm reading him talking, I think it was to Bancroft, he's pretty much just telling her, look, let's work together. And hey, while we're working together and you're cute, why don't we go and have a relationship? I can hear the James Bond theme music in my head in the background. But he was just a player. I find it interesting.
The funny...
Yeah.
I was going to say the funny thing about that, sorry to interrupt, was that Bancroft was at first not too thrilled about Dulles. She thought that he was a bit of a dinosaur, actually, when they first met. And, she seemed to him to be somebody, from a different generation. And she was used to, she was a little bit of a swinger herself, and she kind of liked younger people. And I remember in one scene, she was explaining to him something about the homosexual laws in Germany, and Dulles really had no clue about what the whole thing was, and she had to explain it to him, and he got all embarrassed. And
yeah, he was definitely old world, but But you make the point in the book. I mean, you touch on it. There's a point in the book where you're like, when you have war. and when you have total war, world war, the norms that society functions on breaks down. So here's this young woman where she's she's younger than him. I think there was a decent age gap between the two, but for her, life was a different set of rules, and it was pretty much about having fun and surviving because you don't know how long you're going to be here. So yeah, she sees this older guy, but he was successful, he was rich, athletic, good looking, or whatever. But for her, she was used to a much different crowd because, he's an American. They haven't been bombed. They haven't dealt with all the suffering. But for her, you just really get the sense about who do you think you are, but he does win her over in the end to a degree.
Yeah. As I said, she was a little bit skeptical at first, but I think she had always, even as a young girl, she had expressed an interest and a fascination in espionage. And so Dulles came along and he was telling stories of what he wanted to do, and that kind of helped win her over. And Bancroft was, she was used to dealing with men, and she let it be known around Switzerland, and her friends, she kind of carried on a bit of a shocking lifestyle. She was divorced. She had married an American figure skating champion, but left him for what she said was purely a physical attraction to someone else. It was kind of funny. The mom of the guy that she was going to run away with went to Bancroft and said, "Would you just leave my son alone? You're too much for him." And
so you could do that. I think back it was then. Pretty. Yeah.
And so she ended up, this is another sort of interesting little vignette about Bancroft. She met this Swiss businessman, and that's how she ended up in Switzerland. She didn't love him, and he was definitely not her type. He was, frankly, I think a bit boring. But he concocted this story that he was part Turkish. And this really appealed to Bancroft's sort of sense of adventure and danger. And so she went ahead and married him. And then, I think later he said, by the way, I don't have a drop of Turkish blood in me. So,
sorry.
So sorry, a little lost leader there. So, I think when she was in Switzerland, and especially after that revelation, she was meeting people, and one of her buddies or somebody who she came to know fairly well in Switzerland was the psychiatrist Carl Jung, who she met. She had developed a sort of sneezing affliction, and that Jung learned was brought on by socially awkward situations, and he was able to cure her of that. And I think she developed a little bit of a crush on Jung, and she said that I think she called him one hell of an attractive guy. So. So the two, in some ways, were, they were two ships that were destined to meet each other, I think.
Right. Now, speaking of adventure, so Alan Dulles, November of 1942, his job is to, get some information, because when you have an enemy, you have to learn about them so you can learn to defeat them. But like I said earlier, there's no massive network on the ground. There's no list of contacts you can just go. So he's got to go to Switzerland, the only place left in Europe you can possibly go to, even though that's not completely safe, obviously. And he's got to start from scratch. But like you were saying earlier, because of his personality, he loved this. He reveled in this no rules. You can't really trust anybody. You're trying to get information from someone without giving information. And after this time is over with, he's going to spend the rest of his life, reminiscing about this. So if you could just give us an idea, he gets to Switzerland, and everybody, I guess, thinks that he's the conduit to FDR. The British don't take him very seriously, but he is there to do a job and to have fun, and he pursues both with a lot of energy.
Yeah, he definitely, even though he had just a very little bit of experience in intelligence gathering from his work in the State Department earlier in his career, but he was like a little kid. He loved all of the spycraft and the scheming and the stories. And when he arrived in Switzerland, he had a few contacts with them from his days at Sullivan and Cromwell in the State Department, but he was really ambitious and he really wanted to get it cranked up as quickly as possible. So he basically bragged to everybody in Switzerland. As you said, kind of his cover was that he was, his original cover was that he was going to be a special advisor or a special assistant to the American head of mission. Right. And then there was a newspaper article about him, just a little one in a French newspaper in Switzerland, that erroneously said that he was there to work, as a emissary for Roosevelt. And Dulles was at first kind of horrified about that, and then he realized, well, maybe this will be my new cover. Everybody thinks this is my secret cover, so let's just go with that. So what he did kind of to begin with was essentially he attempted to buy intelligence. And as I was saying, he bragged to everybody about how much money he had. And the Brits got kind of annoyed. There was a British agent in Geneva, and the British had never been ones for purchasing intelligence. They thought it was, you got kind of suspect information that way. One of the British agents said, basically Dulles hung a sign on his door that said, "Information for purchase here." The other thing that Dulles did was and this is very unorthodox, but he just made a habit of meeting everybody who came along. He didn't screen people very well at all. And it was partly because during World War I, when he was in the State Department, he had been alone in the American mission one Sunday afternoon, and he had a tennis date that afternoon with an attractive young lady. And the phone rang. It was somebody who said, "I really have to talk to an American diplomat." And Dulles said, "No, thanks. I'm out of here. Call us on Monday." Yeah, I got a date, and she's pretty good looking. And it turned out that the guy who called was Vladimir Lenin.
Oh my God.
And Dulles he really took that to heart. Right. And, we don't know what Lenin wanted to talk about, but it was obviously a missed opportunity. And so when Dulles was around Switzerland, he, really believed, I've got to meet everybody. Yeah. And, actually it served him in good stead. The British were much more discriminating, and they turned away some good informants who ended up in Dulles's orbit.
Yeah. So I like the idea is in Bern in Switzerland, there's every secret is open. Everybody knows why they're there or whatever, that kind of stuff. So there's no harm in talking to everybody as long as you don't show your hand. So, I mean, at the very least, he can start to get his feet on the ground, learn who the main players are. Give us an idea of some of the people that he's going to meet during his time there.
One of the first characters that he met, and really probably the one that became America's most important source of intelligence during the entire war, was a guy named Fritz Kolbe, who was really, you wouldn't really figure that he would have much to deliver. He wasn't, Dulles actually wrote, he didn't look very smart. He was kind of short in stature, and he was a little bit meek. And he was essentially a clerk, or had a very low-level position in the German foreign ministry. Right. But his job enabled him to read dispatches from the branches of the German military that were being passed on to the foreign ministry, kind of a heads up, here's what we're doing. And Kolbe realized that those were really important, or could be really important if the Americans or the British got their hands on him. So he started coming in on Sundays, and he would just take notes in his almost unintelligible handwriting of all these top secret documents. And his problem was he didn't have anybody to give them to.
Wow.
He was sitting on a gold mine, but he didn't know how to capitalize on it. So he had a friend in Switzerland who originally reached out to the Brits, who said no thanks. They'd heard a story like this once before and had lost a couple of agents, and so I guess you can't blame them. Sure. And so he ended up meeting Dulles in that must have been a very tense meeting. It was at midnight, and everybody was kind of using code names. And Kolbe offered intelligence about German codes. He revealed that the Germans were operating an agent in Ireland. And one of the coolest things was he pulled out a map, or he actually drew a map on the spot, of the Fuhrer's eastern headquarters that showed where Hitler lived, and the movie theater and the railroad tracks. And so it was really cool. And Dulles was really suspicious at first, because people just don't walk in off the street and say, hey, here's some stuff. And he didn't even ask for money. So Dulles was convinced it was probably some sort of trick, and everybody knew that Dulles was there, and he looked like a rookie and a greenhorn, and I'm sure the Germans could have thought, well, this guy is going to be an easy mark, and it took him quite a while. First for Dulles to become convinced about Kolbe, and then for the OSS back in Washington, and the Brits were skeptical and jealous, quite frankly, for a long time. So that was kind of the one key figure. The other was a German named Hans Bernd Gasavius, and this kind of became, Gasavius kind of became Dulles' main contact with the German underground. Mm-hmm. Gasavius had risen through the German security and intelligence or police forces. He was an early member of the Gestapo. Mm-hmm. And he was very ambitious and conniving and arrogant, and he decided at one point when he was in the Gestapo that it would help his career if he spread a rumor that the head of the Gestapo was a communist. Ooh. Well, it didn't really work out very well for him because when the head of the Gestapo found out, he got chucked, and he was actually lucky that he wasn't thrown in prison, but he was kicked out of the Gestapo. And he ended up landing a job in the Abwehr, which was the intelligence arm of the German military. And Gasavius kind of very quickly became opposed to the Nazis around this time. He had seen how nasty they were from his work in the Gestapo. And also, I'm just totally surmising this, but I really get the feeling that he was kind of frustrated the way his career had gone, and he kind of wanted to get some revenge on the people who had kind of blunted his ambitions. Sure. And the Abwehr sent him to Switzerland, where he began to reach out first to the British, and then he became a really important contact for Dulles, and as I said, a link to what was going on in Germany. But once again, there was a lot of suspicion and worry about Gasavius. There's one little story, if I can indulge a little bit. Sure. He was talking with Dulles. It was about their second or third meeting, and they were sitting around in Dulles' office, which is also kind of his apartment in the old quarter of Bern in the capital. And Gasavius pulled out this little black notebook, and he began to read word for word top secret American transmission out of Switzerland to Washington. Wow. And Dulles was gobsmacked. There was no way that the Germans should have been able to intercept it, let alone break the code. And there was some pretty sensitive information in it that actually had cost somebody their job. And Dulles was really impressed. When you can read somebody's mail, that's not a secret that you give away unless there's something important about it. Right. So from that point on, Dulles began to really trust Gasavius, and they worked quite closely, really through the end of the war after that. Well,
let me ask about Kolbe. So he didn't ask for money. So why was he bringing this incredible information to them? And why was the second gentleman bringing information? Was it sounded like for the second gentleman, Gasavius, if I'm saying his name right, that it might have been personal or whatever, but was the first guy just against the Nazis as well?
Kolbe, was opposed to the Nazis. He had, as a youth, he'd been a member of a youth group called the Wandervogel, which was kind of like the Boy Scouts, but there was a lot of sort of morality about it and ethics. And he just never joined the Nazi Party, and he remained opposed to them, throughout his whole life and throughout the war. Right. He also was opposed to communism, and he was worried about what the Soviets might do after the war. So he really wanted to work with the Americans and the British. And also, I think definitely with Kolbe, that he had a real hunger for adventure. And he loved, as the relationship with Dulles evolved, he loved the little spy craft, and they would send postcards to each other with, really obscure, like I went skiing and jumped successfully 3 times. And that meant that, I got your 3 messages or something. Wow. And even he devised his own code, which he tested out on some code people at the foreign ministry in his own office. And they said, yeah, that's a really good code. And so he started using that to communicate with Dulles. And, by the end of the war, he was pulling together all sorts of grandiose plans to help the Allies invade Germany. And I think he wanted to be something more than just a spy. And after the war, I think he thought he might be able to land a pretty senior job in a new German foreign ministry. And he seemed like he was positioning himself for that a little bit. But I think he just loved the adventure of the whole thing.
Well, and you make two very interesting points. One, you've got to watch the quiet guys. But two, I mean, the Germans can be the superior race all they want, but they need functionaries, and these functionaries have access to all this information. And so you can do whatever you want, but eventually this information is going to end up in the hands of the lower ranks who have to file it away or whatever. And if you don't treat them very well, or if you're not, they're humane or whatever, and you upset the wrong people, a lot of people can have their own reasons for betraying you. And it just sounds like the Nazis, obviously the Nazis upset a lot of people. And I don't think here in the West, we Americans appreciate just how many people were against the Nazis, either in their minds or their hearts. And like these gentlemen actually took some action. But how do you stand up to a state that has all the guns, that has all the power, and is quite frankly not afraid to use it against you, against their own people?
And there were some people who resigned their positions in protest. Ludwig Beck, who was chief of staff of the German army up until 1938, and he resigned when he had supported Hitler early on, as a lot of these guys did, because they were pretty unhappy about the way that Germany had been treated after World War I and the Versailles Treaty, and Hitler promised to undo that. And so they supported him quite widely. But once they saw what kind of person he was, a lot of them began to fall off. And so Beck resigned in 1938 when he learned about Hitler's plans to invade Czechoslovakia and, liberate the Sudetenlands. And, we kind of know that story. And so he went to work in the resistance from that point as someone who was not really part of the government. But there were others, and probably the most compelling figure, I think, is Wilhelm Canaris, who was head of the Abwehr, which was the military, the intelligence arm of the German military. And he had turned against Hitler and really kind of turns key sections of the Abwehr into little hotbeds of people who were opposed to the Nazis. I mean, it was remarkable that here we are in the center of Berlin, and, one of the most important bodies and, a very important intelligence arm. And there are senior people throughout who are actively spending all of their time plotting ways to bring Hitler down. And Canaris protected them and did what he could. Several of those guys got caught, and Canaris, actually, the war didn't end well for him. He was implicated in some of these plots, and he was executed before the war ended. It's a sad story. So many of these guys did not survive. The Gestapo and the domestic police in Germany and the SS, they knew their business. And you could plot and scheme for a while, but the deck was really stacked against you. It was, some of the stories of the survivors are pretty miraculous, but it was, you didn't have a long lifespan in this occupation.
So speaking of some of the resistance, give us an idea of maybe the earlier plots to get rid of Hitler, because I remember reading at first some people were thinking, well, we don't want to kill the guy. That seems a little extreme. We just want to remove him from office. But I imagine there were those who wanted to remove and those who wanted to get rid of him permanently. But just give us an idea of what maybe some of the earlier attempts to remove this guy.
Probably the first major attempt, and there had been people, when Hitler, I think, became chancellor in 1933, and Führer, and which is a special title that was created in the following year. And there were people who were opposed to him, and kind of individuals. A lot of them communists because of Hitler's stance against communism. But kind of the first major attempt came in 1938, and Beck was a big figure in this. So what he did at that time, Hitler was working on these plans for Czechoslovakia, and Beck and a group of people thought that this would really kind of tilt the German military against Hitler. So he reached out to a number of people, and they developed fairly good plans to orchestrate a coup. And at this point, people really didn't know how bad Hitler was. It was 1938, and they were worried that assassinating him, could maybe start some sort of civil war. Hitler was, at that point in time, was not as bad a figure as he would later become. So they just wanted to arrest him. So they had really a well-developed plan to orchestrate a coup once Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, and a number of generals thought that might start a war and with England, and so they wanted to prevent that, with England and France, and so they began to they hatched this plot, and they reached out to the British and they said, we're going to do this. But of course, Chamberlain was very nervous about what Hitler was doing, and so Chamberlain, as we know, the Munich Agreement in 1938 and appeasement, and it was a shame because the underground and the resistance had put together a pretty good plan to pull off a coup and depose Hitler. They were really despondent when the British went ahead with that, because at that point the German public was pretty satisfied, what Hitler had done. He seemed like a great diplomat, and kind of the wind went out of their sails for deposing Hitler at that point. But there was, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's like, okay, we're going to do this. We need to know what you other countries are going to do, how you're going to react, how you're going to support us, because that's, nothing that happens in a vacuum, and we need to know. And so when they don't get the support they need, I mean, you're absolutely right. It takes the wind out of your sails. And what are we supposed to do now? The people are starting to like him, or they don't know how bad he is, and we can't get assurances from other countries. So it's almost a suicide mission.
Yeah. I mean, the following year, this is, just the story of a lone individual, and he's kind of one of my favorite characters in the book, Georg Elser, who was a communist, and he had a lot of carpentry skills. And he got a job at a construction factory, so he was able to get his hands on some dynamite, and he had a very inventive mind, and he developed a timer for a bomb that was incredibly sophisticated.
Wow.
And he knew that Hitler was going to give a speech in November in a particular beer hall. So Elser began sneaking into the beer hall at night, and he would wait in the bathroom till it cleared out and all the employees went home. And then he would go and made a place to hide his bomb in a pillar. He cut a little hole in the pillar and put a little door over it, and did this over a series of nights. And it just shows Hitler was incredibly able to avoid assassination and coup time and again. And on this particular evening, everything was set. The bomb was placed, but there was bad weather, and Hitler was going to fly back to Berlin. And because of the weather, he had to take the train and leave early. The bomb went off exactly on schedule and killed a bunch of people. It would have killed Hitler if he was there.
Wow.
And Elser ended up getting picked up at the border. He was trying to get into Switzerland with directions about how to make a bomb in his pocket.
No.
You'd want to get rid of that stuff as quickly as possible.
Shoot that out the window.
But I mentioned that story just because time and again, Hitler avoided these, really well thought out and really good coup attempts or assassination attempts. It was uncanny.
But then there comes the other part. I mean, Hitler, he's about to start World War II, and then he just has a string of victories. And I mean, there's Poland, there's Denmark, there's Norway, and then there's the Low Countries, and then there's France. And you've got to be thinking, the people, they might not like war, but hey, they're winning. They haven't lost yet. But then comes Russia, then comes all the horrible things that happen in Russia. And around the time of Stalingrad, you make a point in your book that there was a much bigger plot to go after him. Because they've suffered so much since then. How could the people not be on their side?
That was kind of the occasion of probably the next big coup attempt. And as you said, it was after Stalingrad and the disaster when the Sixth Army was lost. And it really was on Hitler's hands. He had directed a lot of that battle, and it was hard to point the finger at anybody else but Hitler. And it was really interesting because, as you said, up to that point, Hitler and the German army were on a roll. But after that defeat, there was a lot of grumbling around Germany. There was one resistance group in Munich, the White Rose, that was basically some college kids. And after that defeat, they spread some materials around the campus, and several of them ended up getting caught. Sophie Scholl, who was a biology student, a number of others were beheaded. There was a good movie made about that. But the generals, and particularly on the Eastern Front, and a lot of the generals who were opposed to Hitler came from the Eastern Front because they had seen how terrible it was, the Einsatzgruppen that roamed around, rounding up Jews and anybody else, and just, the mass murders. And that really didn't sit well with a lot of senior officers. So they several of them devised a plan in March of 1943 where they were going to blow up Hitler's plane. Mm-hmm. And the two officers were Henning von Treschow and Fabian von Schlabrendorf. And they got Hitler out to the Eastern Front where he was interviewing his troops. Mm-hmm. And they had, once again, they had put together a really cool bomb. It was disguised to look like a couple of bottles of Cointreau. Uh-huh. And they asked a German officer who was traveling with Hitler to, take the, this back to Berlin with them. They said they needed to settle a bet with somebody, a friendly wager. And so they got the bombs on the plane with a fuse that was, I think it was set for half an hour, and it was a highly reliable fuse, a highly reliable bomb. Right. And they sat around listening to the radio, and they were sure that Hitler's plane was going to be blown from the sky, and they could not believe it when they heard that Hitler had safely landed. Oh. One of them had to rush to catch up with the bomb before anybody figured out what it was. And they were able to retrieve it and get rid of it.
So what happened?
And I think there was a lot of debate about that. They kind of later thought that the bomb had been placed in a cargo hold on the plane.
Right.
And the cargo hold had a heater on it normally, but on this particular occasion, there was some speculation that the heater malfunctioned, and so the cargo hold was cold, and then maybe that had interfered with the fuse. Oh. And because they tested the fuse afterwards, and it seemed to work. But once again, by a hair's breadth, he meant. And then a few days later, they still kind of had the coup plan in place, and they thought, well, maybe we can still enact it. And the German officer stepped forward in a suicide mission, right. And so he took those bombs and strapped them to himself with a 10-minute fuse. And Hitler was going to give a tour, or he was going to take a tour right. of some captured German armaments. And so this officer, the plan was that he was going to strap these under his clothes, set the fuse, and then go position himself as close to Hitler as possible and blow himself and Hitler up.
Wow.
So that he was able to see Hitler, and he got close to him and remained right next to him throughout this tour. And you can just imagine this bomb strapped to you, knowing it's going to go off in just, minutes. And Hitler, for some reason, decided he had to leave, and he took off, well before the tour was supposed to have ended. And this poor guy was like, oh, my word. What do I do now? And so he rushed into a bathroom and was able to defuse the bomb before it went off. But once again, Hitler dodged, the proverbial bullet.
I would have aged 100 years in those 10 minutes. Oh, my God. I'm sure he did, too. But so Hitler escapes again. Now, and this is the part in your book. Well, first of all, let me go back to something when you were talking about the officers and the generals in the East who want to remove Hitler. You make a very good point in your book about these are men of honor, and battle is one thing. You take on the enemy, but what is happening behind the enemy lines has nothing to do with honor. What they're doing to the Jews and any other resistors. So this certainly rubs these very honorable men the wrong way, but. And you make a very good point in your book. They took an oath not only to, I guess, the German state, the Nazi state, but they took an oath to Hitler personally. So it must have been very hard for them to square themselves with this oath that they took, but also removing this monster who was going to bring about the destruction of their country.
And that was a constant problem when they went, the people who had joined the coup attempts, and we're looking for additional recruits, and that was a constant problem. And you wonder if you wanted to be uncharitable, you could say that the officers were hiding behind that that oath and was saying, well, I gave this pledge. But I think it really was for many a kind of just a test of their manhood. They said it, they took it very seriously. And also, the one thing that I kind of came across in doing the research is a lot of the generals, really felt responsible for their troops. They wanted to end the war, but they didn't want to be seen as traitors either. Right. And they didn't want to put their men at risk. And, even after the war ended, some of the people who had plotted against Hitler and when their involvement came out after the war, they were not welcome around Germany because, right. People, and it's natural, I guess, at some human level of their sons and fathers were getting killed. And here was somebody who was working with the Allies. And even though Hitler was a monster, but, he also contributed to, family members getting killed. So it was a real sort of tricky balancing act for a lot of them.
Yeah, and that was one of the things, not to jump ahead, but I really enjoyed about the end of the book, finding out what happened to some of these people. Yeah, and they had to deal with the consequences of their action, even though they had their reasons for doing it. So getting back to Dulles for a second. So he's finding out about the German resistance. He's gathering information, and then suddenly in Casablanca, FDR makes his life a whole lot harder. Just the idea of just trying to help the resistors, much less actually, help them succeed. But tell us a little bit about FDR's, and I still cannot figure this out because even Churchill seemed to be surprised. If you can just give us an idea of how FDR thwarted some of his own men.
Yeah. What you're referring to was a meeting that Churchill and Roosevelt had in Casablanca in a very early 1943. Mm-hmm. And they had talked, apparently, it's a matter of some historical debate, but right. Apparently while they were there, they had talked about the idea of unconditional surrender, but it seemed to they didn't really reach any agreements about it or any final decisions, or so Churchill thought. And the two of them were giving a press conference, and kind of out of nowhere, Roosevelt departed from script and said, "Oh, by the way, we are going to insist on the unconditional surrender of the Axis countries." And Churchill was a bit alarmed by that. It kind of sounds obvious, but there was a lot of implications for what that might mean going forward. Right. And it did make life very difficult for Dulles. The main thing that the resistance and the German underground wanted from him was a promise that Germany would be well treated after the war. If these guys were going to risk their necks in getting rid of Hitler, they wanted to make sure that the country would be, kept intact and wouldn't end up like after World War I. And Dulles was not able to offer that promise because of Roosevelt's Casablanca declaration. And Dulles spent, the rest of the war sending, new message after new message, pleading, will you just soften it a little bit, throw these guys a bone. Right. They really want to help out. They want to get rid of Hitler, but, we got to give them something to believe in. And Roosevelt really dug in his heels, and there were a lot of people who were opposed to his unconditional surrender demand, including Churchill and key member, the head of the OSS, William Donovan, I think, was opposed. There were key members of the American military, mm-hmm. and kind of their thinking was that it would really help the kind of German propaganda, and it did. Right. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, made a lot of hay with this. We've got to fight to the bitter end because there is no cutting a deal with the Americans. They are gonna really nail us. So might as well just die on the battlefield. Yeah, and that was a constant refrain from Dulles that you've given the Germans something to fight for with this unconditional demand.
Yeah, because it said with just one little sentence, it becomes all or nothing, and no one's going to choose nothing. That's just not the way it is. You make a point in your book, if you could drill down on it for us a little bit about, I was trying to figure out, were the resistors in Germany not taken seriously by the West, or was it maybe Dulles wasn't taken seriously by some of his leaders, or maybe was it a combination of both? Because here, you would think Dulles is bringing them this information. It can't get any better. Hey, there's some people who want to resist that need our help. We just got to help them along the way. And if you could put the unconditional surrender aside for a second, I'm just trying to figure out why they just weren't taken that seriously by those that mattered back in Washington.
Yeah, I think partly Roosevelt. I think that William Donovan and the OSS, they were interested in working with them.
Right.
Roosevelt really had no interest. He wanted to pursue the war to the bitter end, and working in the resistance had kind of made that unconditional surrender demand. Maybe would call that into question. And there was some suspicion about how trustworthy they were, and Dulles, for all of his background, he was one guy in Switzerland, and people really weren't sure how seriously they could take his, whether they could believe what he was saying. And he actually had a lot of difficulties early on in his assignments. He reported things back to Washington that were wrong. Made he missed the mark by a wide margin on some things. Which really undercut him. At one point, he got a message, and this was early on, he got a message back from the OSS that said, just by the way, the War Department is discounting by 100% the information that you're sending. So that didn't leave him in a very good stead. To be fair to him, those were early days, and he made some mistakes, and he definitely got, he righted the ship later on. But at the end of the day, it was one guy saying these things, and the Americans were just, we don't really quite believe it, and we're not quite sure what they would do anyway. And even if they succeeded in eliminating Hitler, there's just going to be chaos. And what is that going to mean for the war? And, they really believed in the battle plan that they had for defeating Hitler on Germany, and, with putting a real punctuation mark on it. And, Roosevelt had seen how it had been after World War I, and how messy that peace treaty was, and he didn't want to have another negotiated agreement that maybe would leave a lot of the sort of German war machine intact. And it was just once again, as we were talking earlier, you need to put yourself in the mindset of those times. And Germany had, in their view, been responsible for World War I. There had been a lot of fighting in the 1870s, and Germany at that time was seen as just a real bad egg. Right. And there was some of the discussions about what to do with Germany after the war, where that it had to be broken up. And Henry Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, wanted to reduce it basically to an agricultural, a group of farmers. So I think they just wanted to eliminate the German military threat once and for all.
Yeah, and you certainly can't fault them for that. So getting to the other bombshell of your book that I really liked. So Germany, the resistors aren't getting very well, getting very far along with as far as Washington and the decisions being made. And I was kind of shocked about the degree, and this is where I want you to weigh in, the degree of some in Germany going, well, if the United States is going to be like this, maybe we can find some way to end the war with Russia. We'll keep some territory, you get some territory, but maybe we should actually turn to the country that we're fighting, work out something with them, and we'll end the war on our own. Obviously we'll get rid of Hitler, but we'll still be a very powerful Germany if we can make peace with Stalin. Because, he certainly doesn't want the war to continue, because at this point, Russia is still suffering a lot. I was just amazed about there was talk of turning to Russia and turning away from the West.
Mm-hmm. I didn't really appreciate that either until I was doing the research, and it makes sense when you put yourself in that time. Mm-hmm. The Germans and the Soviets after World War I, the Soviets hadn't come out of World War I in very good stead either. You might remember that the U.S. actually sent troops right to Russia in 1918, and so there was kind of this commonality between the two of them, that the West was decadent and hadn't treated us very well. So they kind of had that background. In fact, I think parts of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, were trained in the Soviet Union during the war. I mean, before the war. So. Right. And the sort of the political background in Germany was certainly, there was a leftist element to it. So it wasn't that much of a stretch, although Hitler hated the communists, and, they were blamed, the Nazis blamed the communists for a lot of what had happened between the wars and, causing a lot of difficulty. Right. There were a lot of people, spread throughout the German government who had some good feelings towards them. And of course, there was the unbelievable non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement from, I think it was 1939 to 1941. So there was some background between the two, and particularly as Germany got farther and farther into Russia, as it was pushing eastward. There were some in Germany, and when the U.S. entered the war, and Himmler was among them, who kind of thought, with the Americans and that economy coming, and maybe we should just kind of do a deal with the Soviets now. We've got a lot of territory, and there were kind of low-level talks, peace feelers between representatives, or kind of representatives of representatives, I'd say. Right. Between the German governments and the Soviet governments. And it's kind of hard to say how serious it was. There was a lot of dancing back and forth. But it was something, as you said, the underground members who Dulles had contact with. And they were more than happy to feed that information to him because they thought it would kind of maybe tilt the U.S. more towards aiding them. There was a group that they talked about a lot, the Free Germany Committee, which was made up of German officers who had been captured at Stalingrad. And, for kind of the military historian buffs among your listeners, we all have the pictures of the German army being marched off into the frozen tundra at the end of Stalingrad, and very few of them ever returned. But a number of officers, a couple hundred, were selected, and they were put on trains and sent to very nice POW camps elsewhere in the Soviet Union, and where they had libraries and sports facilities. And the Soviets began to recruit them to, for kind of a propaganda campaign. They produced a newspaper that they dropped over German troops, kind of encouraging them to surrender. But there was a lot of suspicion among members of the resistance and among some Americans and British even, that those officers were also being trained to kind of form sort of a shadow government that the Soviets could install as soon as the war was over. And in fact, some of those people did receive fairly senior jobs in the East German government. So all those things sort of played on Dulles's imagination, and he reported them to Washington, where they received varying degrees of acceptance. But it was, for the resistance, it was a very strong and compelling card to play with the Americans.
Wow. And just a side note before we go on, you have to admire something about Stalin, who's in a life or death struggle, and he's lost millions of men, millions of Russian POWs, but he's also at the same time making a contingency plan in case he survives, in case he wins, to not only keep Russia, but to be able to control Germany through these German officers. So again, it takes a certain amount of brass from Stalin to be able to think that far ahead. You have to admire that kind of, I'd hate to play chess against him.
And, the Americans they flirted with the idea of putting, I can't remember the name of it just offhand, but putting together a group similar to the Free Germany Committee, kind of an American response. And it really didn't go anywhere. They were afraid that when the Soviets found out about it, that it might be seen as kind of a provocative move. And also, there was one document that I read that was pretty interesting, where they admitted, we don't think we can do this that well, and putting together, for one thing, they hadn't captured as many people as the Soviets had, as many Germans. But they just thought, they thought, well, the American government really can't keep up with the Soviets on this score. So it was something that we never really engaged in. But you got to give Stalin from the very beginning was looking 3 steps ahead in as you put it, the chess match. And you don't get the same sense that the Americans in that Roosevelt were. They were, focused on, they were so transfixed and focused on winning the war on the battlefield that, the planning for the post-war environment, it took a long time to get going. And when it did, it was not very clear. And, Roosevelt was determined to, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but Roosevelt was determined to make friends with Stalin, and he really thought the U.S. could work well with the Soviet Union after the war, and you would find this sort of commonality of interests. And, he had great hopes for the United Nations. That was kind of the big dream, that the Soviets and Americans would be the two big boys in the United Nations. So that was kind of his post-war plan. But, I think Stalin was more realistic, and as I said, he was just kind of always thinking a couple moves ahead.
Yeah. So 1942 goes by. We get into 1943. The good news is the war is starting to turn. That's all good. But now Dulles, with all of his contacts, is really starting to be apprehensive about Soviet Russia, about being a partner with Soviet Russia, and about the future of Europe after the war, that it looks like the Allies are going to win. So his fear of Stalin and what Stalin's capable of is starting to grow as he's getting more information.
And that really kind of drove him more and more into the camp of the German resistance. As that fear grew, he was, as I said, he was just more and more convinced that the Germans were the German underground. It was a group that we had to embrace and had to work with. And as we get into 1944, and he's starting to pick up some of the planning that the resistance is making for Operation Valkyrie, what became the July 20, 1944 attack on Hitler. You can see Dulles' messages to Washington really become kind of more and more desperate almost. And, he tells Washington that, they can save American lives if they succeed in this. And we have to give them some help. And he was just not getting any of it. And at one point, the German resistance went to Dulles and said, we'll even help you invade Berlin. We know a number of German officers, generals will lay down their weapons, and if you want to mount an aerial invasion on Berlin, we'll help you do that. And I don't think Dulles even took that seriously. It was, once again, you couldn't go to Washington and say, these people that you've never heard of have, formulated this huge plan of attack, and all you have to do is this. I mean, obviously it was going to be a non-starter. But, just walking up in July 1944, Dulles was learning more and more about what was about to happen, and he was warning Washington about it. But you can just really sense the frustration from him. At one point he said, I don't even know what our policy is. Just before that attempt was made on Hitler's life. Yeah,
and that's staggering. So I'll let you cover something else, and I just want to mention something, and then we'll kind of get close to wrapping this up. So obviously, Italy is the soft underbelly that Churchill spoke of. Italy is invaded. Mussolini falls. If you want to talk about Valkyrie a little bit, I just want to mention real quick. With the chances of the Americans, the powers in the West, trying to help the German resistance, that certainly, any chance of that is certainly dashed after the Battle of the Bulge, because here we're thinking about helping you, and then you launch this massive offensive or whatever. So that just wasn't going to happen. So if you could maybe speak a little bit about the question of Northern Italy or Valkyrie, and then we'll just kind of wrap it up with and finally getting a glimpse that maybe after all Himmler was a good guy, because he tries to certainly tries to reinvent his image as he knows the war is going to come to an end.
As you said, after Operation Valkyrie and the failure, thousands of people were rounded up around Germany, and hundreds, if not thousands, were executed. And Dulles lost a lot of his network in that bloodletting. And Gazavius, who he had worked with so closely, he'd been in Berlin at the time of the coup attempts, and he went missing. Nobody knew where he was. And it was really kind of a dark period for Dulles personally. And, people who were close to him, Mary Bancroft, talk about how the light kind of just went out for him. Right. But that was revived a little bit in quite dramatic fashion, actually, in early 1945, when Dulles was at home one morning in Bern. He received a call from a friend of his who was in Swiss intelligence and said, "You're never going to believe who's in Switzerland right now, and he wants to see you." And that was Karl Wolff, who was the SS general, and he was in charge of the entire SS force in Italy.
Wow.
And Dulles really couldn't believe it at first. Wolfe actually, he was on a train that was passing through the mountains, and an avalanche came and wiped out the railroad tracks. And Wolfe, who had reserved cars on the train so that he could slip into Switzerland without being noticed, was forced to get out and trudge through the snow and ride into Zurich with everybody else.
Wow. But
he met Dulles in an OSS safe house in Zurich that evening. And he had a pretty amazing story. He said that he was ready to surrender all of the SS troops in Italy, and also that he was pals with Albert Kesselring, field marshal, who was in charge of the German army. And he said, I think that I can convince Kesselring to surrender his men. And I mean, that was staggering. That was 1 million men that were being put on the table for Dulles. There's also, just to, diverge slightly for a moment, it had probably even bigger implications for what was, probably the biggest American fear at the end of the war. And that was that the German army, or the remnants of it, would somehow be able to make it to the Alps and the mountains of Austria and Italy and burrow in. And there was all kinds of intelligence that they were digging tunnels and moving factories and stockpiling food, and they put together a commando unit that they called the Werewolves, which I think is a wonderful name for a commando unit. And the Americans were terrified about this, and they had some estimates that they could prolong the war, the Germans could, by 2 years if they were able to burrow into the mountains. And the Americans were determined to prevent it from happening. As it would turn out, it was almost entirely wrong. Goebbels had been able to fan American fears about this, and there was nothing like the flight towards the Alps that the Americans thought might be happening. But anyway, they were convinced that it was, and if they could prevent this Italian army, the German army in Italy, from reaching the Alps, that had to be taken.
Right.
And so Dulles decided to pursue that, and he told his bosses about it, and went straight up to Roosevelt, who was delighted. But unfortunately for him, Stalin found out about it. Mm-mm. And for Stalin, this was kind of a terrifying development. Stalin had spent a lot of the war really worried that the Brits and the Americans would somehow team up with the Germans, and all three of them would turn against him. And, he kind of, as the, communist member of, the war, he thought, no, I'm kind of the odd man out, right. And these capitalists and the Germans are going to, inevitably they're going to come out to get me. And when he heard what Dulles was doing, he thought, okay, I knew this was coming. And so there really were a series of bitter exchanges between Roosevelt and Stalin over these talks that Dulles entered into. It turned out Wolfe actually, what he was doing was discovered, right. And he actually had to go explain himself to Hitler in a very terrifying, a very terrifying meeting in the Führer bunker up in Berlin. But he was able to get out of it, and they were able to arrange a surrender that took place on May 2nd. It was only about 5 days before the war itself ended, but I think still a lot of good came out of it. I think Wolfe was on his best behavior, and Hitler had ordered that a lot of Italian artifacts and factories be destroyed, and none of that happened. I think because these talks were taking place, as you talked about with Himmler, Dulles was receiving a lot of these sort of peace feelers late in the war, and some of them were from people who had kind of connections to Himmler. And, when you think about Himmler, that's one of maybe the ultimate war criminal. And right. It's just astounding how in the latter part of the war, how he thought that maybe he could rehabilitate his reputation. And it also shows that Himmler he knew how bad he was, that he had to take. He probably didn't know how bad he was, but he knew that he was in some pretty serious trouble. Yeah. And so he reached out to the Swedes and kind of arranged for some Swedish Red Cross, I should say, for POWs to be treated better. And he arranged for some Jews to be gotten to safety. Actually, he received some money for it, but he was doing things like that to kind of make himself look a little bit better in the eyes of the Allies. And, it was a lost cause. If he was caught, he was going to be the first one to meet a hangman's noose. And he actually, at the end of the war, he kind of tried to hide himself as an enlisted man and finally got caught. But it was incredible, all the peace feelers that he put out to various people, and was desperately trying to leverage whatever power he could into saving his own neck.
Wow.
The Samsung Galaxy Launchpad, powered by iHeartRadio.
Maybe you've heard her on the radio. Maybe you've seen her on social. She's a talented singer-songwriter. She's hilarious and real. She's Jax. And this is her new song, Cinderella Snap.
Snow White said you tried to kiss her, so I'll just buy a new glass slipper and burn your castle down. And kids, that's how Cinderella snapped.
That's another awesome track from Jax, who also is just an awesome person with an awesome story. Been singing since she was 10 and had her breakout hit last year with Victoria's Secret. So get ready to hear a lot more from Jax along with other Samsung Galaxy Launchpad stars. Samsung is teaming with iHeartRadio to support these rising young artists, helping them create and capture moments with the amazing new Galaxy S23 Ultra. And Jax is just incredible on social media, so I can't wait to see what she does with this phone. Get yours at Samsung.com.
And just to let the listeners know, the whole thing with General Wolf and Operation Sunrise, you go into really great detail about that, and that was one of my favorite parts of the book. But then everybody on the Allied side gets horrific news. FDR, obviously, not too long after Yalta, passes away. And then, as bad as that is for the Allied cause, because for some people, I mean, he's been president 4 times. He's the only president a lot of people could possibly remember. But then, I guess the political infighting with the OSS comes back to haunt all of those people, especially Dulles, while he's in Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. That was, Roosevelt created the OSS, and he was kind of the defender of it. But it was there were a lot of people, and there was who didn't like the OSS and the FBI and people in, members of the military intelligence. It was a very sort of controversial organization. And, I think a lot of it was just rivalry and power grabbing. And because Donovan and Roosevelt had a decent relationship, Roosevelt was kind of the protector of it. And as the war wound down, there was the intensity of the attacks on the OSS, from within the American government really heated up. And the OSS had been some really impressive accomplishments, but there were some other things that maybe, particularly in Asia, it hadn't accomplished quite as much. So there were a lot of people who had their knives out for it. And there was a study that was done about the OSS that I think probably was somewhat biased. Some key members of the American Army played roles in that. And Edgar Hoover was able to get his opinions out in this report. And so Donovan could see that the OSS was in a bit of trouble, and he proposed and was kind of working on a new intelligence service to replace the OSS. And Roosevelt was considering what to do, and at this point, he was becoming more and more sick, and Donovan knew that the clock was ticking, on Roosevelt and the future of the OSS. And when Roosevelt died, Donovan was actually in Paris. He was at the Ritz Hotel, and he was just distraught when he heard about the president, partly because of he knew him quite well, obviously, and there was that relationship, but also what it meant for the OSS, which was disbanded in the fall of 1945, and some parts of it were hived off into the State Department, but OSS offices around the world were drastically cut back, and it kind of began a period of sort of soul searching in the U.S. about what to do, and in terms of forming a new intelligence service, which of course eventually became the CIA. But there was definitely a period right after the war where U.S. really didn't have an effective overall intelligence gathering service. And of course, this was when the Soviets were, they were wasting no time getting set up in East Germany and had designs, through the strength of communist parties in Western European countries and Italy and in France. And we had always lacked good intelligence about what was going on in the Soviet Union during the war. They were our ally, and we weren't supposed to be spying on them. So it was a difficult time. Actually, one of somebody who Dulles met, Reinhard Gehlen, who was a member of the German military intelligence, actually ended up working with the Americans after the war, and kind of went back to Germany and helped set up the American intelligence service in Germany.
Wow. And believe it or not, for our listeners, we haven't finished the book, and we certainly haven't finished the story. Dulles will be back, and then you've got the entire Cold War and everything that goes on, where America has to catch up very quickly with all the amazing spy work and political maneuverings of Stalin, because he is justifiably paranoid about what the Western powers may do. I mean, America came out of this much stronger, obviously. We weren't bombed, and now we've got 92% of the world's gold, and Americans sitting pretty. So Stalin is going to do whatever he can to offset the economic might of the United States. So if it's okay with you, Mr. Miller, I want to leave something for the listeners to read to. But again, we haven't finished it off. And just an absolute corker of a read. Everybody should check it out. And obviously, Mr. Miller's other work. But again, this book is Agent 110, An American Spymaster, and the German Resistance in World War II. Mr. Miller, thank you very much, because just a corker of a read. I really enjoyed the week and a half that I spent going through this, and I learned a lot. And if I can say, that's saying something. Well, great. It was. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for having me on. Sure. So everybody check it out. I mean, also, even though your publisher sent me a paper copy, I certainly appreciate that. It is also available on Audible. I listened to that as well, just so I could really be ready for this, and that was presented very well. So again, everybody check it out. Obviously, there's lots of different places you can find it. And Mr. Miller, thank you. And next time you write a book, I'm hoping you pick up where you left off with Dulles, but that's just my personal wish. We can have you back on the show. That would be great. Thanks. All right. Thank you very much. And as always, for everybody, take care. Greetings from Central Virginia. Just one more thing before I let you go. When you get a moment, please go to podcast.study and take a quick survey for me. I'm trying to get more sponsors for the show to, justify to the wife all this time that I'm spending. Again, that's podcast.study. Please do it as soon as you can. I need about 1,000 of you to do this. So again, just take a couple of minutes when you can, and I would really appreciate it. So show me some love, people. So I've helped you with your shaving. I've helped you with your home-cooked meals. Who knows what else I can bring onto the show. But again, I would really appreciate it if you could do this for me. Take care, everyone.
Growing a business brings pressure. It's not easy to maintain momentum and still keep employees engaged. Fortunately, there's Insperity. Their scalable HR solutions help me with hiring, training, HR administration, and compliance while giving my employees competitive benefit options. When my people are able to thrive, my business can adapt and prosper. With Insperity, nothing seems impossible. Insperity, HR that makes a difference.